Hello, everyone. Today I will talk about the European Union, soft power and hard reality, and ask the question if the EU is fit for global leadership. My name is Herbert-Michael Zapf, and I am adjunct professor at Brest Business School and at ESCP in Paris. Let me ask you, how many of you are familiar with the term end of history? Popularized by political scientist Francis Fukuyama in his 1989 essay and 1992 book, The End of History and the Last Man, Fukuyama argued that liberal democracy had emerged as the final form of government. This theory assumed a world where democracy and market economies had triumphed, bringing about an era of stability and predictable economic cooperation. He says, I quote, "What we may be witnessing is not just the end of the Cold War or the passing of a particular period of post-war history, but the end of history as such. That is the end point of mankind's ideological evolution and the universalization of Western liberal democracy and the final form of human government." Unquote. Well, we now see that this idea, once celebrated after events like German reunification, was premature. The world has become increasingly volatile, marked by the rival of authoritarianism, deep ideological divisions, economic nationalism, trade wars, and protectionist policies, all of which have reshaped the global landscape in ways that Fukuyama has not predicted. Perhaps these contradictions are stronger than ever, and history is not over. Perhaps it has only just begun. Who knows? But let's stick to the facts. What exactly is going on there right now? Of course, there are various geopolitical hotspots. China's new geopolitical role, Russia's war against the Ukraine, many regional conflicts. But no one seeks so actively, radically, and comprehensively to reshape their country and the world like the current US President Trump does. That is why he initially stands at the center of my analysis. And here's my agenda. I have split my lecture into two parts. In the first part, I will talk about the changing environment, and in the second part about the consequences, the policies, the strategies. So I will talk first about the changing geopolitical economic landscape, using in the second step the US tariff policy as a key element of changing the environment. And then I will look at the consequences for the world, the European Union, Latin, but also for the United States themselves. In the second part, then I talk about the European Union, the European integration process. I also will talk a little bit about history in order to understand the background of its current state and its ability to change. I will talk about, in the next step, about gaining strategic autonomy, and finally about the relationship between the EU and LATAM. Talk about the European Union as a soft power, and I would like to support this by some facts and compare this to the United States and China. You find the European Union on the right-hand side, and also the weaknesses and limitations. I use the euro as a currency, and to reach the US dollar figure, you have to deduct 15% from the euro figure. So we do see that the United States spend a lot of money on defense, 850 billion. They have a integrated army and they are a nuclear power. China, I wouldn't take this figure too seriously. For China, probably they spent probably a multiple of that. They have the world's largest standing army, and they are also a nuclear power. And you see the European Union spending today 250 billion. They have a fragmented army, not a proper European army, but 27 national armies, and only France is a nuclear power. So they do actually depend on NATO and particularly the United States when it comes to defense. We talk about security dependencies. The United States are self-reliant in energy, defense and nuclear space. China as well is working in this direction. And the European Union relies on the US nuclear umbrella. They do import LNG, semiconductors, critical raw materials. So they are actually vulnerable to energy shocks, supply chain disruptions, and dependent on others. The decision making is a critical issue. The United States have the presidential system, which enables rapid action. China have their proper system, the centralized one-party decision-making system, and in the European Union, unanimity is required in most of foreign and security issues. So that makes actually foreign policy and crisis response rather slow and inefficient. Industrial and tech power. The United States has global leaders in various areas. China as well is working on that. And the European Union has a strong single market as an economic giant, but has no global tech champions. Again, relies on external inputs from others. So this actually leads, when we look at the global perception, to what we have called soft power as far as the European Union is concerned. Strong in diplomacy, a payer, not a player, while the United States is considered to be a protector and China a challenger. Let me now put the current changes in a historical context. History is not necessarily a guideline for the future, but it can help us to better understand developments. We in the West are somewhat frightened by the current shifts and the decline of the so-called West. But we should remind ourselves that the world order as we know it today hasn't always existed, and to put it diplomatically, not all of it has worked well. But whether young or old, we all grew up in a world where Western power seemed natural, even eternal. The United States led the global economy, set the security agenda, and shaped the institutions we call international. That was the coordinate system we relied on for a long time. This meant for, at least most of us, stability, security, and prosperity. One of the most insightful voices in understanding this transition from a completely different perspective is Amitabh Acharya, one of the key architects of a movement that challenges the Western-centric foundations. Even if we may not follow his argument in every detail and facet, it nonetheless helps us to see today's changes in a broader context and thus to better understand them. In his book, The Once and Future World Order, published in 2025, Acharya argues that long before London or Washington, the Islamic world formed the backbone of global commerce. From the 8th to the 15th centuries, Baghdad, Cairo, Damascus, and later Istanbul anchored a trade network that linked China, India, Africa, and Europe. This system functioned largely without centralized imperial control. It was animated by trust, Islamic contract law, and the cultural openness of merchants and scholars. With the rise of the Mongol Empire in the 13th century, the Pax Mongolica stabilized overland routes across Asia, linking Europe to China in a way unseen since the Roman Empire. At the same time, the Indian Ocean emerged as the world's most dynamic maritime space. Indian, Persian, Arab, Malay, and Chinese traders built dense, self-regulating networks. If you will, and this map illustrates it beautifully, the Indian Ocean did in the maritime arena what the Mongols did over land. India is far from a colonial periphery and was a central exporter of cotton textiles, sugar, and stamps, contributing over a quarter of global GDP in early modern period. These systems, Rakhaya claims, were open, cooperative, and multipolar. Even in Europe, not all integration was imperial at that time in the Middle Age. The Hanseatic League, which lasted roughly from 1150 to 1650, was a voluntary alliance of merchant cities from Bruges to Novgorod, and offered an alternative logic: self-governance, rules-based cooperation, and shared security. Centuries before the EU, the Hansa managed commerce through law codes, common warehouses, and diplomacy. It was resilient, decentralized, and driven by merchant rationality rather than military conquest. The map illustrates the extent of the Hanseatic League around the Baltic Sea and far into the European hinterland. The rise of the West disrupted rather than evolved from previous orders. Armed with ships, cannons, and corporations, Western powers inserted themselves into Asian, African, and Latin American trade systems, not to participate as equals, but to control and dominate. The Spanish and Portuguese conquest marked the beginning of the West's disruptive entry into global systems. In Latin America, powerful pre-Columbian empires such as the Aztec, Maya, and Inca had complex economies and well-integrated networks long before the European arrival. The arrival of European conquerors violently dismantled these civilizations and imposed colonial rule. Meanwhile, in Africa, the transatlantic slave trade, largely driven by French and British interests, devastated societies and fueled the economies of the emerging empires. The British colonization of India and the destruction of Islamic trade networks transformed a decentralized, negotiated global economy into one defined by hierarchies and resource extraction. The settlement colonies in what would become the United States involved the systematic displacement and killing of indigenous peoples, further illustrating the violent foundations of Western expansion. Yes, and on this map, we see in red the countries that were considered European or Western over a longer period of time. The blue ones were under control for a shorter time, only in specific regions, or were at least heavily influenced, such as China or Japan. The new global world, the so-called liberal order, was neither liberal nor global. It was Western. And for most of the world, it was empire. This is Archaea's view. I believe the world is not black and white, and violence and war and dominance was omnipresent. Nevertheless, a very interesting, completely different view on the world. But no matter which perspective we take on the world and its changes, the world has changed and will further change. And we in the West, and by that I mean today Europe and Latin America, since the US is actively driving this transformation, must figure out how to respond. However, let's first take a look on how we can identify the changes in today's world. I will look at four aspects. First, at the power transition from west to east, the fragmentation of the global world, and also at crises which can act as accelerators of change, and how interdependence can be used as a weapon. Now, let me start with the first point. We do see the GDP of North America and Europe, that is the blue line, as a percentage of the total world GDP. And this percentage is declining over the last 45 years, while at the same time the Asian one is increasing. I have even another very interesting chart, and this is about the main trading partners of the countries in the world, be it the United States, Europe, and or China. And in 2000, it shows this map that most of the countries have the European Union as the main trading partner. But this has changed significantly in 2024. Now we look at the fragmentation of global governance, and I have chosen the cumulative number of regional trade agreements in force since 1915, and these agreements have increased significantly, particularly over the last 20 years. Now you can argue, why are trade agreements a sign for a changing environment? Well, in fact, it weakens the multilateral global cooperation that dominated the second half of the last century. And this pattern is not limited to trade. In digital governance and climate policy, regional alliances and emerging national carbon clubs are increasingly shaping the global landscape, replacing or sidestepping multilateral solutions. All these developments point to a world order that is becoming more multipolar, regionally fragmented, and norm diverse, with significant implications for Europe's ability to shape and navigate international rules and standards. Yeah, global crises often act as catalysts, and I have listed here a few of them which have triggered changes in the world. The 9/11 attacks in 2021 actually led to the rise of a US security state, created new alliances and reshaped the Middle East, and spending on defense increased significantly. And it led to counterterrorism, global counterterrorism, surveillance, and a lot of other things which changed the world. The global financial crisis in 2008 certainly eroded the trust in Western capitalism, and it led to populist movement all over the world. The Arab Spring created power vacuums, civil wars, and produced huge migration waves. COVID, of course, Russia, Ukraine war, Israel, Gaza war, That will create new alliances, reshaping global supply chains and calls for peace frameworks, of course. As I already said, trade relations are a good thing. They are beneficial to both sides, create mutual dependencies, and have a stabilizing effect. But that trade relations can also be used to bring about change was already known to the uh, former German Chancellor Willy Brandt, who wanted to use this instrument positively in order to destabilize in the long run the former authoritarian Eastern Bloc in Europe, and above all, GDR, East Germany. He summarized this under the slogan Wandel durch Annäherung, change through rapprochement, and it worked. Now, a country is using it to secure unilateral advantages, accepting as collateral damage the destruction of a functioning world order. We could clearly observe at the 2025 Shanghai Cooperation Organization Summit in Tianjin, in China, that India's Narendra Modi, who had maintained a neutral stance for so long, has now obviously been driven into the arms of the anti-Western alliance alongside China and Russia. In the course of globalization, countries have become increasingly interconnected and mutually dependent over the past decades to the benefit of all parties. Companies have sourced their inputs globally along the value chain, relocated production to places with the most favorable conditions, and opened up new markets. This system works well as long as all players behave rationally, because such dependencies can also be turned into weapons. NATO is being called into question. The mutual defense commitment itself. We spent the whole life believing that the Americans were serious about their security promises, and now, when it really matters, it turns out they didn't fully mean it. Take a look. You didn't pay, you are delinquent. No, I would not protect you. In fact, I would encourage them, Russia, to do whatever the hell they want. The EU was formed to screw the United States. To me, the most beautiful word in the dictionary is tariff. These are genuine quotes from the American president. You simply couldn't invent something like this. Since tariffs have truly become a central instrument of American policy, not only in economic and trade matters, but also in US geopolitics, we will take a closer look to better understand what's going on. Now, I would like to begin with an excursus on this topic, which I have titled Basics of Trade Theory and What Trump Thinks Trade is About. I will use a very simplified model to show what happens when an economy opens up to trade, starting with a closed economy. The benefits that consumers and producers derive from the exchange of goods and services are measured in welfare economics by consumer surplus and producer surplus. Consumer surplus is the advantage buyers receive when they are willing to pay more than they actually do. Conversely, producer surplus is the profit sellers make when they can sell a good at a price higher than their production costs. Here we have the classical supply and demand curves. The welfare of a country is therefore consumer surplus plus producer surplus, CS plus PS, in a closed economy again. This is represented by the yellow and the red triangles in this diagram. Now, what happens when the economy opens up to trade? We assume that foreign producers are cheaper, so we begin importing parts of the product. This increases total supply and shifts the supply curve to the right. So from SD, domestic supply, to ST, total supply. The imported quantity is the difference between QT and QD. So this is what we see here on the bottom, and what we call import. Now, as a consequence, we see who benefits. Consumer surplus increases, as shown by the larger yellow triangle. And that's the core idea of trade. The gains to consumers are clear. What about producer surplus? At first glance, it might look like it has grown too. And it has. But we must take into account that the part of supply is now imported, meaning that a portion of the producer surplus is transferred abroad. It no longer accrues to domestic producers. So domestic producer surplus, ceteris paribus, shrinks. In this animated diagram, it is shown that trade overall is beneficial, but not all groups gain equally. Consumers benefit, while domestic producers, initially suffer. The economy needs to undergo restructuring, and the affected industries must adapt as their prices are too high to remain competitive. More competition, however, is the ultimate driver for stimulating efficiency, innovation, and quality improvements. And it is precisely these uncompetitive sectors that are now being protected in the US by Trump's tariffs, which shift the supply curve back to the left, raising prices again and harming consumers and ultimately the entire economy. In effect, Trump is acting like a lobbyist on behalf of these uncompetitive industries. This was already quite enlightening in terms of Trump's perspective on trade, and it becomes even clearer when we examine how he interprets the trade balance and the conclusions he draws from it. The trade balance is a systematic record of the difference between a country's exports and imports of goods and services over a specific period. It can be seen as a mirror of a country's competitiveness. If exports exceed imports, the country has a trade surplus. If imports exceed exports, the country has a trade deficit. And this is now the trade system, how it works. We export goods and services, we get paid for that. Therefore, we can afford imports, and we do import the goods. Trump's logic goes like this. If a country has companies that export, then it benefits from foreign trade. Heaven forbid that imports come in, because that means other countries are exporting. That's not ideal. It must be tolerated in exchange for the right to export. This is also a bit the logic you hear in the media. If you listen closely, the more we export, the less we import, the higher our export surplus, the better. Which is, of course, complete nonsense. Economically, it's just the opposite. The goods we export are gone. We can't eat or use them anymore. Others have them. Why would that be a benefit in itself? The true benefit lies in what we import, because that raises our standard of living. We need exports to earn the money to buy imports. So the economic logic is exactly the reverse of what Trump thinks. It's really just nonsense. This is pure business logic, as if the goal of the economy were to make companies rich and generate profits. Companies exist to raise the standard of living for consumers. A market economy manages to generate a better standard of living for the general public than any other economic system. That's the reason for it. And it's far removed from this narrow business logic. Companies are just a means to an end. They do well because profit maximization usually leads to an overall benefit for society. So trade enables the division of labor, and each country focuses on what it does particularly well, rather than trying to do everything. It sells that to the world, earns money, and then buys a multitude of other goods, and tariffs hinder this process. It is from these imported goods that I derive my standard of living. The division of labor is one of humanity's greatest cultural inventions. Without it, we'd still be walking around in loincloths. Yes, many people don't see that, and that's exactly the point. We specialize in one thing we do well. A trade-based economy is the source of prosperity in a civilized society on Earth. Consequently, the EU and other countries do not screw the United States. The United States are just not competitive, at least in some sectors. So let me summarize, and then let me very carefully shift to a completely different direction. Perhaps for Trump, it is not really about creating a fair world order, as he claims, but about something much bigger. But here's my summary of the excursus. Trade is overall beneficial, but not everyone benefits from trade to the same extent, and certainly not at the same time. This is a kind of gateway to changing, improving political economic mechanism in favor of a particular group. And this is what Trump does. He measures the success of foreign trade by the volume of exports and sees imports merely as a necessary evil, the opposite of the economic view. He feels that others are taking advantage of the US and uses tariffs as a punishment. So he acts as a lobbyist for US businesses and punishes domestic consumers. But maybe it's about much more. He argues that the dollar's role as the world's reserve currency makes it overvalued. True or not, the deeper reality is that the US has financed its lifestyle on credit, letting others work for it. To meet global demand, the Fed has printed massive amounts of dollars, fueling chronic deficits and record public debt. The deal being pushed is simple. Keep reserve dollar dominated, but these reserves are only promises on paper, and Washington can devalue the dollar at will, shifting the debt burden onto foreign creditors and boosting US competitiveness. Tariffs are merely a form of leverage in this negotiation to agree new and lower interest rates. The real goal might be to avoid state bankruptcy by forcing the world into terms favorable to America. Tariffs then are less about trade and more about preserving the system. If the true stakes were acknowledged, it could shake the very foundations of the global economy. I will later provide some figures that substantiate this argument. But back to the spectacle surrounding the tariffs. Here we see the president on what he called Liberation Day in April 2025, launching a wave of tariffs across the globe, starting with a base tariff of 10% and additional so-called reciprocal tariffs of up to 50%. I won't go into detail about how exactly the tariffs are calculated, but in principle, They are based on the idea of a balanced trade relationship with each respective country. I have selected a few examples. You see them in the first column, unfortunately in German. I do apologize for that. In the second column, you see the so-called reciprocal tariffs imposed by the US government, and the third column show the alleged tariffs imposed on the United States, and this is compared with the existing tariffs based on WTO calculations. And you see there is a huge gap between Trump's assumptions and reality. So it's Trump's secret how he comes up with these numbers. But that may be as it may. This policy is unilaterally imposing tariffs and is called a beggar thy neighbor policy. Such policies only work for one country and if no one retaliates. But in practice, unilateral tariff increases almost always lead to countermeasures. And we saw exactly that in this case as well. Many countries respond. Tariffs were then rolled back only to be raised again, a complete mess. It was probably intentional. As countries respond to each other with retaliatory tariffs, the system escalates. Tariffs rise higher and higher, and international trade suffers significantly. In extreme cases, this can lead to what's called a prohibitive tariff level. Tariffs so high that international trade becomes economically meaningless and comes to a halt. The logic is not new. History provides two striking examples of the dangers of protectionist escalation. The McKinley Tariff in 1890 was designed to protect American industry with steep import duties. Even more severe was the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act, 1930, passed during the early stages of the Great Depression. It raised tariffs on more than 20,000 imported goods. Other countries quickly retaliated, leading to a global tariff war and a 60% collapse in international trade. This protectionist spiral significantly deepened the global depression. So protectionist trade policy may be politically popular among one's own supporters, but economically it is deeply damaging. It leads to lose-lose scenarios, undermines trust, weakens global value chains, and ultimately hurts consumers, businesses, and jobs. We now want to examine the implications of these measures, which largely depend on how important trade with the US is for each region. The more a region trades with the US, the greater the potential impact. This slide shows the export flows of 4 regions or countries as a percentage of their respective total exports. The figures are approximations from various sources, and please keep in mind these are not absolute figures. There are 3 key aspects I want to highlight that are particularly relevant to today's topic. And let me simplify the chart and highlight the respective aspect. First, we see that exports from Latin America, the EU, and China to the US make up a significant share of their overall trade. In contrast, US exports to these regions are much less important. As mentioned earlier, this reflects the relatively lower competitiveness of the US economy. For Trump, the reason lies in what he considers the unfair trading practices of American partners. But even in cases where trade appears balanced, like between the EU and the US, it often isn't, because the EU's total trade volume is higher than that of the US. A nominally balanced flow still results in a trade surplus in favor of the EU. It's also important to note that while the US has a significant trade deficit in goods, it has a surplus in services, which partially offsets, though does not eliminate, the overall deficit. This also means that retaliatory tariffs of equal size would hit the other countries harder than the US, given their higher dependency on exports of goods to the American market. My second point concerns intra-regional trade. According to the gravity model, countries tend to trade more with those nearby. Distance matters. But look at this. While intra-regional trade within the USMCA, East Asia and the Pacific accounts for around 50% of their total international trade and nearly 60% within the EU, intra-Latin American trade stands at just 13%. Clearly, there is significant room for growth. And third, there is significant room for growth for the trade between the EU and LATAM countries. Only 5% of total EU trade goes to Latin America. This figure is 13% in the opposite direction. However, because of the much higher trade volumes of European countries in total, same as in the EU-US trade relation, the EU has a surplus in the trade of goods and services of 33 billion euro. And by the way, what is actually going on with the trade agreement between Mercosur and the EU? Negotiations have been ongoing since 1999, 25 years, and the agreement is still not in force. Although a political breakthrough was reached in 2019 and then in 2024, the process has stalled due to a number of obstacles. On the EU side, key concerns include environmental protection, especially deforestation in the Amazon region, along with pressures from farmers who fear unfair competition from South American agricultural imports. On the Mercosur side, there is frustration over what is perceived as moving goalposts and growing demands for additional sustainability commitments, which some governments view as protectionism in disguise. Perhaps it will eventually enter into force, especially because in today's global political climate, the agreement carries not only economic weight but also growing geopolitical significance as a potential foundation for deeper cooperation. We'll come back to this at a later point. Anyway, what are the consequences for the EU and LATAM? Despite all their differences, I try to identify some commonalities, and that led to some interesting insights. Both the EU and LATAM are rule takers. The EU, once a central pillar of the liberal West, has become an uncertain middle power. LATAM, historically on the periphery, is now evolving into a resource-rich pivot region. Both are highly dependent on external actors, economically, politically, and militarily. Geopolitically, they are under pressure to choose sides, yet neither is truly shaming the game. Finally, while both regions have enormous strategic potential due to their size and shared democratic values, they lack coherent strategies to fully realize this potential. And what are the consequences of this policy for the US itself? As far as the current account balance is concerned, it stands at nearly 4%. That's here. In 2024, it has been negative for decades, unlike in many other countries where it was positive in Japan, Germany, and China. The persistent deficit is accompanied by a dramatic public debt, which has been further exacerbated by the big, beautiful bill. This in turn leads to an enormous interest burden in the future. In the US, interest payments amount for 11%. of the national budget, where in Germany it's only 2.3%, although due to rising debt levels, it is increasing there as well. Looking at this development, the large current account deficit and the extreme level of public debt with no light at the end of the tunnel, it's reasonable to suspect that US tariff policy might actually be pursuing a very different objective. That's what I mentioned earlier, a couple of minutes ago. Sure, the US could pay interest rates, but it wants to continue living beyond its means. In that context, this motive is far more important than for the US, than what Trump calls fair trade. This suggests that the changing global framework conditions are even more profound and lasting than they may already appear. To satisfy global demand for the dollar, the US Federal Reserve has printed massive amounts of dollars. This has enabled Americans to finance a chronic current account deficit and accumulate dizzying level of public debt. These reserve assets are little more than calligraphic promises, and the US retains the power to devalue the dollar at any time. Doing so would reduce the real burden of public debt, since debt is repaid in cheaper dollars, and improve the current account balance by making US exports more competitive, artificially more competitive, and imports more expensive. In other words, dollar devaluation acts as a hidden transfer mechanism from foreign creditors to the US economy. The real ultimate goal is to avoid state bankruptcy by pressuring the rest of the world into accepting a deal that is favorable to the United States. Therefore, tariffs could serve as a means of pressure in this negotiation with foreign creditors. Growth forecasts are not very promising either, but with production shifting to the US due to tariffs, it is quite possible that growth rates will not be affected initially or even positively. Let me now come to the second part of my lecture, and I will begin with the integration process of the European Union, and I want you to watch a film first.
The first step in the recreation of the European family must be a partnership between France and Germany. The structure of the United States of Europe, if well and truly built, will be such as to make the material strength of a single state less important. Small nations will count as much as large ones and gain their honor by their contribution to the common cause. But I must give you a warning. Time may be short. At present, there is a breathing space. The cannons have ceased firing. The fighting has stopped, but the dangers have not stopped. If we are to form the United States of Europe, or whatever name it may take, we must begin now. And therefore, I say to you, let Europe arise.
What a speech, just 1 year after the most devastating war in European history. Churchill called for the creation of the United States of Europe and urged haste, likely because of the rising threat of communism in the East. However, many observers believe that he probably never assumed for a second that his own country, the United Kingdom, would be part of such an alliance. This reflects the deeply ambivalent relationship that the UK, the island, has historically had with continental Europe. The two politicians who eventually took up Churchill's call and pushed forward the European integration project were, alongside many other committed Europeans, Konrad Adenauer, the former mayor of Cologne and the first chancellor of the Federal Republic of Germany, and Charles de Gaulle, leader of the French resistance against Nazi Germany and later President of France. But even these two had very different visions of Europe, as can be clearly seen in the following two quotes. Adenauer, deeply marked by Germany's catastrophic past, saw European unity as a moral and political imperative. He says, quote, "The unity of Europe was a dream of a few, it became a hope for many. Today it is a necessity for all." Unquote. De Gaulle, who had led Free France in its fight against Nazi occupation, envisioned a Europe of nations built on the strength of sovereign states. He declared, quote, "You cannot stitch Europe together like a patchwork quilt. Europe must be built from strong nations." Unquote. So he rejected the idea of a federal Europe with supranational institutions, favoring intergovernmental cooperation instead. This fundamental tension, how much integration do we want and how deep should it go, has shaped the European project from its very beginning up to the present day. At its core, this is about decision-making powers and thus about power itself. If we assume that the overall volume of decisions remains more or less constant, then existing territorial authorities, municipalities, regions, but above all national governments, must transfer competences to the new territorial authority, Europe. That means a loss of power. And another key question is, where is each decision actually made? Critics argue that the principle of subsidiarity, which holds that decisions should be taken at the lowest possible level where it makes sense, and only at a higher level if this creates added value, is not always respected. In other words, the European Commission increasingly draws competences to itself, even though it should not. Regional integration, something that's perhaps worthwhile keeping in mind, should be understood as a process, not a permanent status. Regional integration is the process where countries come together to form closer ties in order to achieve shared benefits such as increased trade, improved security, and greater political influence. There are different levels of integrations which increase from inside out of this diagram. So we have here in the free trade area, it goes over customs union, common market to the political union. The former NAFTA, now USMCA, is merely a free trade area that eliminated some tariffs but has since significantly raised many of them again. In comparison, Mercosur, which with its common external tariffs applied to third countries, has already taken a considerably more advanced step, and it continues all the way to the EU, which is by far the most advanced form of regional integration in the world. The truly interesting question, however, is how such a process of regional integration actually comes about. What determines its speed and depth? Because although there are many similarities with globalization, there are also some important differences. Unlike globalization, regional integration is driven by specific concerns and interests. A lot would say it was because World War II with the 60 to 80 million dead is particularly devastating war is such a cause. I don't think so. European history, like world history, by the way, is the history of wars and migration. That is certainly one factor, but it wouldn't have been sufficient on its own. Others claim that the US had an economic interest and wanted Europe as a sales market. That's certainly true as well, but not sufficient either. No, in reality, the reason was quite different, an ideological one or a geopolitical one, depending on how you look at it. It is the division of the world, cutting right through Europe, indeed right through Germany. You can clearly see that in this small image, the fear of communism's spread shaped political strategies across the globe during the Cold War, but response varied by region. In Asia, countries responded by forming regional alliances like ASEAN, which sought to promote political cooperation and economic development to contain communist influence while managing internal tensions. Latin America, by contrast, experienced intense internal conflicts and US-backed anti-communist interventions with less emphasis on regional integration and more on direct military and political confrontation to prevent communist insurgencies. And in Europe, the threat of communism led to the creation of the European integration project, an unprecedented effort to bind former rivals economically and politically together. These diverse approaches reflect how different regions adapted their political and strategic responses to the common challenges of communism, global expansion. The interesting thing is that the USA also underwent a strategic shift at that time. After the First World War, the US retreated significantly into isolation and only reluctantly entered the war late after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor to also fight the Nazis. And after the Second World War, they transformed into a global policeman, a role they later seemed to want to give up. So strategic reversals are nothing unusual in US foreign policy. The European integration process has been anything but simple and certainly not a big bang. I don't want to go into the individual treaties in detail. You see them here on the chart. That would be very interesting, but it would require a lecture on its own. Let me just say this. There have been numerous treaties as well as several failed attempts. One notable example is the European Defence Community, an attempt to create a joint European army and which failed in 1952 in the French National Assembly. It was probably too much, too early, bringing together the Germans and other European nations into a common military force so soon after the war, and that was simply too ambitious. But just imagine for a moment what might have happened if it had succeeded. Europe today would likely be much stronger and more unified, and one may speculate whether Russia would have dared to invade the Ukraine. The central treaty that established today's European Union, into which the various earlier agreements eventually converged, is the Treaty of Maastricht, which came into force in 1992. The treaties of Maastricht and Lisbon together laid the foundations and completed the framework of the EU as we know it today. They brought about major institutional reforms, including the reweighting of votes in the Council of the EU, the creation of a permanent president and the European Council, and the establishment of the post of a High Representative for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy. They also introduced a legally binding Charter of Fundamental Rights, significantly strengthened the role of the European Parliament, and included a withdrawal clause, Article 50 of the Treaty of the European Union, which ultimately provided the legal basis for the Brexit. This brings us to the goals of the European Union, and afterwards we will take a brief look at where the EU stands today. From the beginning, the EU aimed to promote peace and prosperity, create a common market for goods, services, capital, and people, foster economic growth and social progress, and establish a competitive market economy. Starting with the Maastricht Treaty in 1992, its goals expanded to include economic and monetary union with the euro as currency, sustainable development and price stability. Additionally, the EU pursues freedom, security and justice without internal borders, environmental protection, social inclusion, and the promotion of cultural and linguistic diversity. Fundamental values such as human dignity, democracy, the rule of law, and human rights remain central to its mission. Today, the EU, with its 27 member states and around 400 million people, and a GDP of approximately 13.8 trillion euro, is the third largest economy in the world. There is a single market with the four pillars: free movement of goods, services, labor, and capital. The agricultural sector is, with 1.5% of GDP, relatively small. The EU has 24 official languages, which many see as a major problem, while others view it as a reflection of plurality and cultural diversity. A subset of countries have a common currency, the euro, and there is a common European flag, a European anthem, and a common passport. In fact, all European citizens hold two citizenships, one national and one European, although most of them aren't even aware of it. And this is not only just a semantic detail. Important rights derive from European citizenship, such as freedom of movement and residence. People are allowed to live and work anywhere within the EU. And finally, the EU is a champion of international law, multilateralism, and diplomacy, and promotes human rights, development, and cultural diplomacy. What is negotiated in Europe often becomes a blueprint for other countries. Companies like Apple, Microsoft, and Meta have developed global data protection regulation standards globally, even outside the EU, to simplify compliance and avoid managing different data systems. On the other hand, countries such as Brazil, Japan, South Korea, and even parts of the United States like California with its CCPA have introduced data protection laws inspired by the GDPR. These countries recognize the value of aligning with an established and credible international framework. This illustrates how the EU, through its regulatory power, exerts global influence without relying on military or economic coercion, a clear example of soft power in action. Even the harshest critics of the European integration process would likely admit that its primary goal has been achieved. Never again war. While wars have taken place in Europe, such as the war in former Yugoslavia and Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine, that's bad enough, but these are not wars within the European Union. The internal market, with its freedoms of movement, that has generated prosperity, and even the exit of a member state was handled in a civilized and negotiated manner. In the past, such a scenario might well have led to armed conflict. To put it in visual terms, Putin and Trump are playing ping pong with the Europeans. They have no say. The US negotiate with China without even asking the Europeans. In the entire tariff drama, we play no role. We are not taken seriously as a player. The big players are elsewhere. Even little Russia is a big player. China is a player. America is a player. And Europe is being steamrolled. But we can't let that happen forever. It could be really dangerous. We'll end up with bad deals, to use Trump's words, especially in global trade. But even worse, bad deals in security. Do we really want a protector who, when things get tough, says, well, that's not what I meant. I'll protect you, but only if you hand over your natural resources? That's not what we had in mind. This chart really hits the nail on the head. Europe today is an uncertain middle power, highly dependent on the US security under growing geopolitical pressure and politically fragmented. Henry Kissinger, the former US Secretary of State, is said to have even once remarked, "Who do I call if I want to speak to Europe?" Now, how to gain strategic autonomy? At the moment, there's a lot of talk about a Zeitenwende, a typical German expression meaning a historic turning point or watershed moment. However, there is a mismatch between what the EU aims to achieve and what it can realistically deliver. The EU can become a global leader if it closes the gap between its ambitions and capabilities, if it takes matters into its own hands, becoming a political union. And a political union, by definition, is a union with a government elected by a real parliament that has a monopoly on power, including command over a joint army, and it must be a federal state, the United States of Europe. In an era marked by geopolitical fragmentation, economic coercion, and accelerating technological competition, the concept of strategic autonomy has moved to the center of the European agenda. Against this backdrop, former ECB President Mario Draghi was tasked by the European Commission to produce a major report on the future of Europe. The report, released in September 2024, seeks to define what Europe must do to maintain economic strength and further gain political sovereignty in a rapidly changing global landscape. At its core, the Draghi report addresses how Europe can build the capacities it needs, industrial, digital, financial, military, to act independently when it must and cooperate when it chooses. Europe already achieved quite a bit. As already explained, it started with the European Economic Community that was just a free trade zone where all the gains from specialization occurred. That was a huge success story. Then we should have created a political union. Adenauer tried with the goal. They wanted to establish a Western European Defense Union. That was the first attempt at a political union. The second attempt was in 1982, when Helmut Kohl became German Chancellor. In his inaugural Bundestag speech, he said that founding a political union in Europe was his government's main goal. Not everyone agreed, especially not the French. They didn't want a political union with a monopoly on power and a joint army, but they did want a common currency. They wanted to socialize the D-mark under the name euro, and they got it. The military union, which Kohl saw as the next step, never happened. So the order was reversed, and Kohl used to say, when buttoning his vest. If you start with the wrong button at the bottom, it'll never sit right, no matter how far you go. Specifically, the French got their monetary union, the socialization of the D-mark, because it wasn't necessary for them to make also the force de frappe on the table and to put the force de frappe on the table and make it a package deal. That wasn't required because German reunification was looming. The Soviet Union had collapsed, and Mitterrand saw a chance to block reunification. He even traveled to the GDR in late 89 to try and stabilize the regime, just to avoid signing the 2+4 treaties automatically. In the end, Kohl gave in, agreeing to the long-standing French demand to socialize the D-mark, and in return he got German unification. Some dispute this, but most contemporary historians seem to agree. So we reverse the sequence, introduce the euro too early, and now face the consequences with no military union, no common army. Europe has 27 different armies and dozens of incompatible weapon systems. It's a catastrophe. Yes, there are downsides, but it's always about comparing alternatives. And that, I believe, is probably the most important message of today's lecture. Let me now speak about the future relationship between the European Union and LATAM. Despite numerous initiatives and declarations over the decades, Latin America's regional integration remains sluggish. While the region shares language ties, cultural proximity, and common interest, the political and institutional foundations for deeper cooperation are weak. One major reason is the high degree of political fragmentation and ideological volatility. Governments swing between left-wing populism, right-wing nationalism, and centrist liberalism, often undoing their predecessors' regional commitments. This lack of continuity and trust undermines stable progress. Moreover, regional institutions like Mercosur or CELAC remain weak with limited enforcement power and no supranational authority comparable to the EU. Integration is also hampered by deep structural asymmetries. Large economies like Brazil dominate smaller neighbors, and economic models vary widely across the region. Compounding these problems is a lack of physical and digital connectivity, limited trade, mobility, and cross-border cooperation. Adding to this complexity is the broad spectrum of political regimes in Latin America. According to the European Intelligence Unit, Uruguay is the best functioning democracy in Latin America and has even significantly improved over the last 15 years from a score of 8.08 to 8.67. But this is a big exception. On the other end of the spectrum, you have strong authoritarian systems like Venezuela and Nicaragua. Over time, democratic backsliding and institutional instability have weakened the political predictability and shared values necessary for regional unity. Unlike the EU, where post-war democratization fostered a strong integration narrative, Latin America lacks a consistent and unifying political project. Finally, many countries are more economically and politically aligned with extra-regional powers such as the United States, China, or even the EU than with each other. This reduces the incentives for investing in intra-regional frameworks. Integration in Latin America thus remains more aspiration than reality, held back by institutional fragility, political polarization, and competing national interests. So what can we learn from this? Well, I would say the message is quite clear here as well. A few minutes ago, I called for the United States of Europe, also because, frankly, there isn't really an alternative. Latin America doesn't truly have a choice either. If it wants to move toward becoming an integrated region economically, politically, and militarily, and perhaps Europe and Latin America can support each other along this path. This needs to happen in parallel, not sequentially. I'd like to share a few thoughts on that with you. Latin and the EU share strong cultural roots, a long and complex history, and core values such as multilateralism, human rights, and respect for diversity. And this forms a powerful foundation for a deep and strategic partnership. The relationship must be built on mutual learning, as each region has much to offer the other. Latin America has shown remarkable resilience in the face of economic crisis, political instability, and external shocks. The European Union, in turn, provides models of sustainability, inclusive welfare, and supranational governance. Latin America has generated notable innovations. In Medellin, Colombia, participatory urbanism transformed a city marked by violence into a model of citizen engagement, mobility, and social integration. Community-based healthcare, as we see in Brazil. Programs rely on local health posts and community health workers embedded directly in neighborhoods and villages. Another example is digital inclusion through fintech. In countries like Argentina and Colombia, platforms are opening access to the digital economy for people who were traditionally excluded from the banking system. If we turn to Europe, we also see key models that feed into the global debate. The European Green Deal provides a broad framework for climate action and sustainability. The GDPR regulation has become the global benchmark for personal data protection. And finally, the European Artificial Intelligence Act, the world's first comprehensive regulation of artificial intelligence, classifying risk and setting standards for transparency and safety. So on both sides, we are dealing with laboratories of innovation. Latin America often bottom-up, born out of crisis. Europe more top-down through institutional frameworks. Both perspectives are highly valuable for shaping a common future. Yet, to fully unlock the potential, political will and strategic alignments are needed on both sides. This means overcoming internal divisions, building trust, and committing to long-term cooperation rather than symbolic gestures. These are, of course, only a few examples to illustrate the scope. A stronger EU-LATAM alliance would not only benefit the two regions economically and politically, but also contribute to shaping a more balanced, multipolar, and cooperative global order, one that is better equipped to address shared 21st century challenges. That's it. And if today's topic has whetted your appetite for more, I invite you to set out together with ChatGPT or any other artificial intelligence device and app to dive deeper. And here are a few prompts as inspiration. Having said that, well, the question was, is the EU fit for global leadership? And the simple answer is no. So I could stop here and read done. But I'd rather like to offer a slightly more nuanced answer, and summarize this lecture. First, the post-1990 unipolar world led by the United States is over. We are entering a new era of fragmented globalization marked by intensifying US-China rivalry where energy, semiconductors, data, and capital flows have become strategic instruments of power. Second, it's also quite clear, unless we are backward-looking or romantically inclined, in other words, detached from reality, the 21st century challenges cannot be addressed with 20th or 19th century tools. Even the old economic paradigm of efficiency, maximization, and growth is being expanded to include, maybe even replaced, by resilience, adaptability, and strategic autonomy. Consequently, third, in this new context, the EU faces a choice, not between integration and independence, but between deeper unity and gradual irrelevance. The current multipolar landscape also presents opportunities, just as the threat of communism once galvanized European cooperation. Therefore, fourth, to assume a credible leadership role on the world stage, the EU must go beyond soft power. It needs to develop and demonstrate real military, technological, and strategic capabilities while upholding its values and global partnership. And let's now turn to Latin America and its relationship with Europe. Fifth, although the EU and Latin America countries find themselves in different situations regarding economic and political integration, as well as their roles in the global order, they are natural strategic allies bound by shared cultural roots, historical ties, and democratic values. To realize their full potential on the world stage, Latin American nations must move beyond fragmented efforts towards bold, comprehensive economic and political integration. Sixth and finally, an important short-term step in this direction is the immediate implementation of the Mercosur EU agreement, unlocking a great potential with a variety of opportunities for both regions. That's it. To say it a bit tongue-in-cheek, I have served the food for thought. Now let's see what's cooking in your minds. Thank you very much for your attention.